Hello, my friends. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the autosomal DNA results, predicted phenotype traits, and G25 results of an early Iron Age sample from Bulgaria. Now, in this time period, 11th to 2nd century before the Common Era, this region of Europe, southeastern Europe, Bulgaria, some parts of Romania, were inhabited by a Indo-European people called Thracians. They contributed to the genetics of Greeks, modern ethnicities of the Balkans, Bulgarians, of course, Romanians a little bit, and of course, Balkan Slavs. Now, these Thracians, they were Indo-Europeans, but they were not Iranic speakers, nor were they Hellenic speakers. They were sort of a separate Indo-European branch. What is interesting about this sample? It is a male. His Y DNA is actually falls under the E branch of lineages. So it is a his lineage comes from Africa actually. Although my trait predictor cannot determine whether it's E1B or E3B, unfortunately there isn't that much information in this file. It is most likely E1B because that is the most common branch of E in Europe. Unfortunately, as you can see, there is 0 total variants for E1B found in the file. The file is not very high quality, at least when in regards to E1B variants, but it is pretty much most likely an E1B individual because that is the most common branch of E that is found in Europe. When it comes to his mitochondrial lineage, his mitochondrial lineage seems to be K1C1, which is a very common mitochondrial lineage for people of the Caucasus and the Middle East. So both his mitochondrial and his paternal lineages are very common for people of the Middle East and very uncommon for Europeans. But he is a Southern European, and there's quite a lot of overlap between Southern Europeans and people of the Middle East. In terms of the genetic profile, as you can see, the closest populations to this individual are Italians, Southern Italians, Corsicans, and Sicilians are the closest populations to this individual. In terms of the ancient populations, most similar are Mycenaean Greeks, Classical Greeks, Romans. I don't know what Sicani are, but there's also medieval Albanians, which I understand, medieval Central Italians, and Imperial. So it looks like various Southern Europeans are the most similar populations to this individual. And the genetic profile is essentially mostly Anatolian Neolithic farmer, with a little bit of European hunter-gatherer and Caucasus hunter-gatherer admixture, and a tiny bit of Zagrozian Neolithic farmer admixture. This is a very Southern European genetic profile. This individual that I'm analyzing in this video is a very Southern European man. Not so much Middle Eastern, not so much Nordic, just a very Mediterranean Southern European individual. Now, when it comes to his Nashakot results and phenotype, you're actually going to be quite surprised. And I did also cherry pick this sample because I find these samples with outlier results to be very interesting. And this sample actually has blue eye color. You see, when it comes to the eye color prediction, he is scoring blue eyes at 33.5% likelihood, green eyes at 31.4% likelihood, and brown eyes at dark brown eyes at 2.8% likelihood for brown eyes and 0.04 for dark brown eyes. So he definitely doesn't have brown or dark brown eyes. Most likely his eye color is blue or green. And even for hazel eyes, only 10.8% likelihood. So this individual is definitely quite light. And I am not ashamed of saying, I did cherry pick this sample specifically for the pigmentation because I want to show you that among the Mediterranean population, there are people with light pigmentation. When it comes to hair color likelihood distribution, he actually has dark blonde hair. He scores 50.3% likelihood of dark blonde hair. The next most likely hair color for him is light brown hair at 26% likelihood. Then it's light blonde hair. Absolutely crazy. So the third most likely hair color for him is light blonde. And only after that comes dark brown hair, and then it's red hair. And he definitely doesn't have black hair because he only scores 0.018% odds for black hair color. So he's very light in terms of hair color as well. Most likely he has dark blonde hair. When it comes to skin color distribution, he's also scoring very light here as well. He's actually scoring 55% odds for palest skin. So the skin color that he is scoring with my trait predictor is palest skin, not even white, and definitely not olive or Mediterranean. He is scoring 55% odds of palest skin. That is the skin color that he scores. So he's very pale, he's got dark blonde hair, and he's got blue eyes. This is the color that is often attributed to Scandinavians, Irish people, people of the British Isles, Germanics overall, but this individual is anything but a Germanic in terms of his autosomal ancestry. This individual is very Mediterranean. In terms of hair texture, he is scoring mostly curly hair. There is also a pretty significant likelihood of wavy hair, and he probably does not have straight or kinky hair. For nose shape, he is scoring intermediate between Greek and snub-shaped nose. And now for coloring related variants found in the file, what's interesting here, he's got 2 light color variants here, so that's not surprising, of course. Obviously, he's got this type of genotype, considering his results. He's got BH2 and BH1, but he does not have BH3, which is very interesting. So, despite scoring the way he did, he actually doesn't have BH3, does not have blue eye haplotype 3. Now, blue eye haplotype 3 is quite impactful when you do have it, but when you don't have it, it is also quite impactful. You know, but you can still score the way he did without having blue eye haplotype 3, assuming the rest of your genotypes are the way they are in this case. And in this case, they are, they do, he's got 2 light color variants everywhere else. So in his case, if you look at the IRF4, he's got 1 light color variant here. He's got 2 light color variants in this version of TIRP1, also a very big genotype in terms of the effect on pigmentation. So 1 light color variant here. So all this contributes to the score. All of this makes very big contribution. This plays a very big contribution to the score as well. So with this type of genotype, you don't even really need to have the blue eye haplotype 3 to score the way he did. But it would help. And if he had blue eye haplotype 3, he would score even lighter. The result would be even more blue, even more blonde, even more pale if he had blue eye haplotype 3. But he doesn't have it, so there you go. It is actually irrelevant to YSEC, and it plays a little bit of a role in snipper 3 calculation. But still, snipper 3 is going to show him to have blue eyes. If I look at snipper 3 results, snipper 3 is going to say blue eyes, because snipper 3, he's got BH1, BH2, and he's got this genotype right here. Snipper 3 is going to say blue eyes. YSEC is also going to say blue eyes, because YSEC is not even polygenic. YSEC looks at this variation right here, and that's the only thing they look at. So with YSEC is going to say blue eyes. But snipper 3 also looks at this at BH3 as well. But all things considered, I am very confident that snipper 3 is going to say blue eyes. And I'm going to prove it to you right now. We can look at this right now, actually. Despite not having BH3, with snipper 3, he's going to score blue eyes. So yeah, there you go. He's scoring blue. And it's not even close for green or hazel. 330 times more likely blue than green or hazel is not even close for green or hazel in this case. So he's definitely very, very strong prediction for blue eyes with snipper 3 in this case, despite technically not having blue eye haplotype 3, as you can see. But still the prediction is that he has blue eyes. Let's look at the Phenotype Oracle. So keeping in mind that he has blonde hair, blue eyes, and palest skin, these are the phenotypes that show up closest to him. That makes sense, right? And so the closest phenotype is this, then finally this. And this is actually a Mediterranean phenotype. It's a light color phenotype, but it's a Mediterranean phenotype. Now, him being a Thracian, you wouldn't expect a Thracian, somebody from Bulgaria, somebody who's closest to Italians and people from Albania, to look to look like this, right? But then we have to understand that there actually are people from this region, and there actually are Italians and Albanians who look like this. They're just very rare. But if you cherry pick well enough, if you go through, hundreds of different samples, you will find a sample who looks like this. And that's what I did. I cherry picked and I found you a sample who looks like this. So this is really proof that if you cherry pick in if you cherry pick well enough, you can find a Thracian that looks the way these pictures are showing here with the Phenotype Oracle. And for the two-way mixture, let's look at the two-way mixture, the Phenotype two-way two-way admixture models. So the closest two-way admixture is 50% Nordic plus 50% Mediterranean with curly hair. Then the second way to closest two-way admixture is 50% Nordic plus 50% Mediterranean. Looks like here the hair is not curly. Very interesting. The third closest mixture is 50% Baltic plus 50% Mediterranean with curly hair. So Mediterranean is present in all of these. And that tells me that this individual actually scores. That's probably because of the score for facial morphology oracle. There's probably a lot of Middle Eastern on the facial morphology oracle. Let's look at that actually. I think is that Middle Eastern or is that Northern European? That's South Asian. I think that's European. That's Middle Eastern. So there's not that much Middle Eastern actually, but for some reason this individual is still scoring this Mediterranean phenotype in the mixtures. Interesting. That's interesting. Maybe it's because of the curly hair. Yeah, that's probably because of the curly hair. I think it's because of the curly hair actually. So because the hair texture is also taken into account for the phenotype oracles. All right, let's look at the. Actually, I didn't show you the ethnic calculator results. Let's look at that. But I'm not gonna dwell on it too much, so I'm just gonna open it up for you, and you can look at this. And wait, let me show you the S&P count as well. Yes, so you can look at this right now, and you can maybe take a screenshot, or you can pause the video and maybe dwell on it a little bit. But I'm gonna move on. There you go. 421 S&Ps. You can look at it, but I'm gonna close this right now, and let's look at the biomarkers results. All right. All right, we're gonna return to normal. All right, so for biomarkers, he's got below average level of vitamin D levels for his age and the activity level, which is quite bad. For cholesterol panel, he's got a below average level LDL cholesterol, which is actually really good, and a higher level of HDL cholesterol, which is also good. So quite good for the cholesterol panel and lipids panel in general, and above average level of glucose, which is bad, but it's not that big of a deal because it's very close to the average. Above average level of hemoglobin, which is also okay, but it's kind of bad as well. Above average blood pressure, which is also kind of bad, but it's okay because it's close to the average. And below average level of iron in the blood, so that's good because that tells us that he doesn't have hemochromatosis variants. And below average level of sex hormone binding globulin, and below average level of red blood cell count in blood, and below average base pairs to telomere length, so some predisposition to shorter lifespan, and also below average height for expected height, so slightly shorter than average for height. Let's go ahead and look at the polygenic risk scores, and we're going to ignore everything that's close to 1 and only look at the scores that are very distant from 1. So he's got a very, very high odds for kidney stones, below average odds for arrhythmia and nodosum, high odds for hemoglobin E disease. That's interesting, actually. Let's look it up. The keyword is hemoglobin, so let's look that up. Does anything show up in the file? What if we look up E? Does anything show up? No, nothing shows up. Okay, so that's not the main variation that that shows up on the rare diseases panel. All right, interesting. But I do have the display for risk variance here. Okay, he's got below averages for migraine. He's got above averages for lupus. So that has to do with the HLA gene panel. We're gonna keep that in mind. So perhaps above averages. Actually, I don't have to keep that in mind. We have the HLA gene panel right here. So the HLA gene panel is looking pretty good. We can look at this right now before we look at the polygenic risk scores right now, and we can see what he scores. So there are some. No, too much. He does carry some alleles for high odds of multiple sclerosis. Um, What about diabetes? No type 1 diabetes, and some variants for vitiligo, some variants for vitiligo as well. So probably the score for vitiligo is going to be a little bit higher, but I don't see I don't see that many risk scores for type 1 diabetes actually. So probably type 1 diabetes is not going to be very high. Yeah, HLA gene panel is looking quite good. Quite good. Let's go back to the polygenic. Alright, so it looks like he's got below averages for migraine, above average for lupus, very low score for gout, low score for thyroid cancer, low score for eczema, low score for exfoliation glaucoma, which is very interesting. We might have to look that up in the file actually. Let's look that up in the file, exfoliation glaucoma. That might be interesting. And what do we find? We find this genotype which leads to the lower odds of exfoliation glaucoma. Very, very interesting. It seems to be a rare genotype actually. And higher odds for cataracts, very high odds for AMD. Very interesting. Below averages for rheumatoid arthritis, lower odds for Tourette's, higher odds for epilepsy, higher odds for asthma, averages for leukemia, higher odds for vitiligo. Yes, we could expect that because we saw the risk variance in HLA for vitiligo. He's got higher odds for myopia. He's got below averages for corneal astigmatism. So far, we remember that the risks are rheumatoid arthritis. Arthritis is the risk, and hemoglobin E disease. But really, the biggest risk so far is rheumatoid arthritis. And there's also primary biliary cirrhosis, stroke, and male pattern hair loss. That's also a big risk, but this is not so surprising because most people who are of West Eurasian descent, that includes Europeans, South Europeans, Middle Eastern people, people of the Caucasus, people of North Africa, they tend to have some predisposition to losing their hair at an early age. So this is not surprising whatsoever. He's got a lower predisposition to atrial fibrillation, which is good to see. Lower odds of deep vein thrombosis, average odds for cardiovascular issues, really good to see. Average odds for ADHD, higher odds for depression, high odds for bipolar type 1, and high odds for schizophrenia. That's very interesting. So this is actually the most concerning thing in this file that I've seen thus far, and I'm glad that I got to this part of the result, because this is by far the most striking part of the result. It's the very high score for bipolar type 1 and schizophrenia. By the way, the scores for bipolar type 1 and schizophrenia are connected. For most of these for these two conditions, most of the SNPs are interlinked with each other. That means the same SNP corresponds to score for both these two disorders. For both of the disorders, the same SNP goes for both of the disorders. So if you score high for bipolar, you're probably going to score high for schizophrenia as well. And if you score high for schizophrenia, you're probably going to score high for bipolar as well. That's the way my trait predictor works. So I kind of treat them as the same block. It's just one big block. So if you score very high for schizophrenia and bipolar, as is the case with this sample, and that's a very high score, this is definitely worth investigating. And we're gonna look at the result in a little bit more detail in a couple of seconds. He's got higher odds for type 2 diabetes, which is also very interesting. That's also worth investigating. And average odds for type 1 diabetes. All right. Above averages for Alzheimer's and below averages for multiple sclerosis. All right. No risk values for breast cancer, really good to see. Average odds for prostate cancer, really good to see. And he's got 10 out of 14 risk variants for testicular cancer. Actually, he's actually doing quite good when it comes to testicular cancer, despite the 10 risk variants out of 14, which is very high. It's a very high number. But if we look at the keto G risk variants, we can see that in this variation, he's only got one risk variant out of two. Heterozygous genotype. That is actually quite good for Europeans. Europeans tend to have two risk variants out of two. Europeans tend to have homozygous risk genotype. In his case, he's got heterozygous genotypes, only one risk allele. That is a very good result for a European. So he's actually quite protected from testicular cancer, despite the 10 out of 14 risk variants, which is high. Maybe his risk score overall is average. Actually, if you consider that, if you consider the rest of the impact of the rest of the variants, overall it's probably about average. But the fact that he only has one risk variant in this variation of keto G is very good. That's a very good sign, at least in my opinion, because for a European, that's a very good genotype to have. Celiac disease section, he's got no risk variance for for celiac disease out of 8. Really good to see. Do we have any other risk variance in the other conditions? Crohn's disease, nothing important here. Riefenstein's, no risk variance here. Parkinson's, nothing here. And for Jacob Creutzfeldt, 1, but that's common. And for allergies, 5 out of 16, which is very common. That's around 1/3, so that's typical. Nothing else. Pretty good file. We're not seeing that many missed calls. Actually, we're not seeing any missed calls so far. So that's a really good file. I'm really glad to see that. But then again, it's hard to evaluate the quality of the file because for like Fabry, Hirschsprung, we're seeing out of zeros, right? So we're not seeing out of 20, out of 15. We're seeing out of zeros. So in this case, it's not so much about, oh, this file doesn't have any missed calls. It's more so this file doesn't have any data, right? So it's good. It's good when you have a file with a lot of data and no missed calls. In this case, it's a file with no data. So I don't really know if I should be praising it for being so good and not having any missed calls, because in this case, it's more so about not having much data. But anyway, it's got plenty of data. It's got a lot of information as it is. So I guess we're gonna have to go off that. Let's go through the monogenic traits and we'll be done there. So for mental health results, this individual is definitely much more of a warrior than a warrior. He's scoring 56% odds of a warrior phenotype, only 12% odds of a warrior phenotype, so definitely much more of a warrior. Quicker dopamine reuptake, lower dopamine levels, and higher stress resiliency. Now, from my own understanding of the warrior versus warrior dichotomy, I would say that this should lower the odds of bipolar and schizophrenia for this individual. This type of phenotype should lower in terms of its effect on life and the implications on mental health. It should lower the odds of bipolar and schizophrenia. But the way my trait predictor works is that it doesn't. It has no effect. All of these variations and their genotypes, they have no effect on the score for bipolar and schizophrenia. So even though I think it should, I don't let my personal biases and hunches affect the way I code my application. I try to code and only include the variations that have some scientific backing. I don't include my own, personal beliefs or personal theories. I don't do that, right? I only include stuff that's scientifically proven and has some scientific backing to it into my trait predictor. Even though in reality, in terms of the real effect, I am so sure that if we conducted a study into warrior versus warrior phenotypes, we would find a link between warrior phenotype and decreased odds of schizophrenia and bipolar. I am so sure of that. But the study doesn't exist, and there are actually studies that prove the opposite. So, so far, I am not going to include that in my trait predictor because of that. And but nonetheless, this individual is a warrior. I'm going so far off tangent. I'm sorry. This individual is a warrior, so which means quick dopamine reuptake, higher activity of COMT, MAOA, MAOB enzymes. Those are enzymes that break down dopamine in the system, in the central nervous system, which means he's got quicker dopamine reuptake, which means lower dopamine levels, higher stress resiliency, and lower dopamine levels at all times, which means that in stressful conditions, when your body produces more dopamine naturally, you got the optimal dopamine levels to function, which means you're very good in high stress conditions. So that's kind of a good phenotype to have if you're like a soldier, or you're in the military, you're a fighter, you're a UFC fighter, or you're, I don't know, like a pilot or something. Probably not a very good phenotype to have if you're working in the scientific field, if you're dealing with low stressful conditions where you have to constantly keep yourself motivated. This is the worst phenotype you could have if you're like a teacher or if you're, I don't know, some kind of a scientist, right? Probably the worst type of phenotype you could have. But if you're a soldier or if you're a UFC fighter, that's the best type of phenotype you could have. Oh, I'm going on a tangent once again. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. I'm not myself today. For DRD2, he's scoring intermediate number of dopamine receptor sites in the brain. So intermediate predisposition to such conditions as bipolar and schizophrenia, which is also kind of surprising because this sample isn't really scoring all that high for higher number of dopamine receptor sites in the brain. as you would expect for his score, because his score for schizophrenia and bipolar is really, really high, but he's actually not even scoring highest for higher number of dopamine D2 receptors in the brain. So what that tells me is that this individual doesn't score the way he does for bipolar and schizophrenia because of these DRD2 variations, but because of all the other SNPs that contribute to schizophrenia and bipolar that I added to my trait predictor that are not even on the screen. They are the biggest contribution to him scoring the way he does for schizophrenia and bipolar. However, even if you consider these variations in DRD2, he still has all these genotypes that correspond to higher odds of schizophrenia, like this one. This is a big contribution to higher odds of schizophrenia. This genotype right here, big contribution to higher odds of schizophrenia. And all right, went on a tangent again, but anyway, for 5-HT and serotonin, he's scoring intermediate or lower levels of 5-HT and serotonin, so some predisposition to such conditions as anxiety and depression. And what's also very interesting is that he's got this homozygous major allele on ADCY2, which is associated with bipolar disorder, which also affects the score for bipolar and schizophrenia with my trait predictor. I am thinking right now, as I'm looking at the sample, that I probably need to make a separate panel, like what I did with the HLA gene panel, but for bipolar and schizophrenia risk variants, where I would make a panel where I list every variant that goes into these into these traits, and I print the results that based on these variants. That's what I think I need to do now, because I think it would be very useful to know what contributed to the score. I think I should do that. I think I will do that in the future. That should be the next step for trait predictor, showing what, because bipolar and schizophrenia are by far the biggest in terms of SNP count. They are by far the biggest traits that my trait predictor predicts. Look at the SNP count. And this is not even a big file. This is a small file, but the SNP count is huge. And in a big file, the SNP count is 2 times larger. So these are traits that have so many SNPs that are going into the prediction that I need to have a separate page for them. That's what I'm thinking right now. I need to have a separate page for these SNPs, for these pages, for this trait. There needs to be a separate page for that. Looks like he's scoring higher odds of autism for the autism panel, and looks like he's scoring highest odds for lactose intolerance. So he's not lactose persistent. He does not carry any variants for European lactose persistence, it seems. Out of 8 variations, he does not carry a single allele for being lactose persistent. Very, very interesting. For OXTR and empathy gene, looks like he's scoring average level of empathy based on these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 SNPs. So based on these 5 SNPs, he's got a predisposition to average level of empathy. For diabetes, remember he was scoring highest for type 2 diabetes. And the only allele we see here is this. The only genotype we see here is this, which leads to a decreased risk of type 2 diabetes. But of course, we know that this is one SNP. And if we look at the polygenic risk scores page for type 2 diabetes, what do we see? What do we see there? We see 6 SNPs used. So there's quite a lot more SNPs for type 2 diabetes that go into the result than one, right? One risk allele for APOE for Alzheimer's. Very interesting. He did score high for Alzheimer's though. And what was the score for Alzheimer's? Let's look at it again. I think I missed that. I should have talked about that more, but let's look at it again. Alzheimer's. Yeah, he's scoring 2 times the averages for Alzheimer's. So that's a very big factor as well. The APOE risk variant for Alzheimer's is a big factor. So he's got 2 times the averages for Alzheimer's as well. So this person has a predisposition to schizophrenia, bipolar, Alzheimer's, and type 2 diabetes. That's essentially what I can talk about, but that's probably what I'm going to put in the thumbnail. Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, and schizophrenia are the major risk factors for this individual. Let's see. Let's scroll through this result and see if there's anything else I can find. Looks like intermediate or lower odds of cardiovascular issues. That's really good to see. One European EDR allele in this variation of EDR, but that's typical. No micropenis. That's great. That's grand. We can skip through all that. 10 to 20% efficiency in processing folic acid. That's horrible. So from this, we can assume that the homocysteine panel is going to look quite bad, but there's also this gene type in MTHFR, which is quite good. But still, The homocysteine panel is probably going to look quite bad because of this genotype in MTHFR. But we don't know that for sure. I don't know that for sure, but we're going to check that right now. For rare diseases, do we see any rare conditions? We see decreased risk of rheumatoid arthritis. That's pretty cool. But we don't see, we see 5 times risk of rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, that's interesting. And nothing else. All right. For HIV and AIDS panel, there's only this genotype, which leads to a reduction in HIV viral loads, some protection from HIV based on genotype in HLA, which is really good to see. So protection from HIV is always really good. It's also a European thing to have, to be a little bit protected from HIV. For MTRR gene panel, looks like no risk variance for disorders of intracellular cold metabolism. Recently I've just started to skip over that panel. Now for homocystinuria, he's actually scoring intermediate homocysteine levels, which is very, very interesting, because the MTHFR genotype was kind of crazy. But then again, there was the other MTHFR genotype, which is good. There was two MTHFR genotypes. Let's scroll back to them again. Right, so there's two MTHFR genotypes that affect the homocysteine panel. This one is a good genotype, and this one is a bad genotype. So I guess they cancel each other out, and together that results in a normal result, right? And also in the CBS panel, there's these two genotypes which lead to lower levels of homocysteine levels, and this genotype leads to intermediate levels. So all things considered, I guess it makes sense that the homocysteine panel is showing something like this. It's not too skewed to elevated. It's actually still a little bit skewed to elevated homocysteine levels. It's 29% for elevated versus 25 for lower. So it's still skewed to elevated homocysteine levels. So yes, I guess it makes sense. And there is actually even a risk variant for homocystinuria, which I think is a miscall. I am very much convinced that this is a miscall. It's not a genuine result, not a genuine genotype of this individual. No risk variance for muscular dystrophy myopathy, and no risk variance for adrenoleukodystrophy. Really good to see colorblindness panel. One risk variant for colorblindness and OPN1SW. That's quite common. I've seen that frequently, and looks like intermediate odds of obesity. All right, based on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 SNPs. For syncope panel, based on 2 SNPs, above average odds for syncope. So based on these 2 SNPs, this individual has a predisposition to fainting, losing blood flow to their brain. And for blood traits, biotraits panel, looks like they got 1 copy of the hunter-gatherer and 1 copy of the farmer CLT-CL1 gene variant, which leads to intermediate ability to process carbs and sugars. Very, very interesting. Now for the blood group panel, looks like the blood type is very definitively type A. 94.4% odds for type A blood type. That's very, very interesting. Kind of a rare blood type. Most people are type O, but it looks like this sample is type A. Well, this was the Thracian I20180 sample. I sure hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you were entertained by my incoherent ramblings. Maybe you found them coherent. Maybe you were entertained by what I had to say. Make sure you leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed my video. Write a comment on anything you found interesting. Maybe write a suggestion, what you want to see next. You can write a super comment where you donate a little bit to me. Maybe you donate and you leave a suggestion. That way I definitely look at your comment and I see your donation and I think, wow, I'm definitely gonna cover that sample next. Maybe that's gonna happen. Who knows? And of course, you can also look at the description of the video where you can find links to buy my software, which I use to generate these reports, which I made myself. Or you can also find the link to download the file that I analyze in this video, also from the link which is in the description of the video. So check out the description. It's got a lot of cool stuff. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.